With the 3.6 update, Nahida's story is finally complete. Well, at least her character story. If you haven't played through it, then consider this a spoiler warning. In the story, we see her try to recall a faint memory she has that was obscured due to the changes brought on by the Irminsul. Nahida was having one of those moments where you feel like you have something to do but just can't remember exactly what, like when you walk into the kitchen and just blank out. That was essentially the basis of this quest. Despite its rather innocuous start, there is a pretty big twist towards the end. The Traveler and Nahida actually run into a dendro dragon called Apep. But this isn't any ordinary dragon, far from it. By the end of Nahida's quest, Apep tells us a bunch of things from the war in the ancient past, and I'm sure some of you might be a bit lost when you first heard some of the exposition it provided. So in this video, let's break down everything Apep was talking about, the things we know and the things we just aren't quite sure. Before we get into that, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now, I won't go too deeply into the quest itself, but essentially, the entire goal for Nahida and friends was to rescue the dendro dragon Apep. The dragon was one of the last beings still affected by forbidden knowledge, and its death could also lead to the destruction of the Sumeru region itself, so there was a lot of urgency in getting the job done. In the quest, Apep talks to us in two separate occasions. The first is when we find it in the desert, and the second time is after we save it from its affliction. Let me first just say, this thing looks hella impressive. I think so far, it's likely to be the largest dragon we've seen, and even when it was shrouded by the sandstorms, its faint outline reminded me of Jormungandr from God of War. Just an insanely huge serpent with glowing eyes emanating with energy. One of the first things that Apep brings up is the mention of the usurper from beyond the heavens. Apep mentions that it still harbors hate for this person despite the many eons that have passed. What it refers to is the very early days of Tevat. If you're unfamiliar with law surrounding the formation of Tevat, this is probably one of the first things that might trip you up. You see, a long time ago, the world wasn't under the rule of the gods, but instead the dragons. The elemental dragons had full control over the place we now call Tevat, and the strongest among these dragons were referred to as the Seven Sovereigns. They were said to be 7 dragons from each of the elements, and was said to be unfathomably powerful. Now, the usurper is likely referring to the primordial one, who came from outside Tevat, and defeated the dragons, claiming and reshaping Tevat for himself. He essentially usurped their positions as the top of the food chain, and recreated the world for humans. In order to battle this external threat, Apep mentions that the Dragon King Nibelung, which I'll talk about a bit later, brought forbidden knowledge from outside this world, and with this power, they believed they could destroy the heavenly principles. This particular line is interesting for a number of reasons. The first is that halfway through her speech, the term usurper is no longer used, and instead, Apep refers to the heavenly principles as their main adversary. This is important because it implies that the primordial one and the heavenly principles could be one and the same. Up till this point, there hasn't really been a strong connection between the two, but with this phrasing, it's now implied as such. With the current law up to this point, what happened to the primordial one isn't really known. But if this turns out to be true, then it means they are alive and well, at least up to the point where the traveler meets them. On top of that, at the end of Apep's conversation with us, she mentions to Nahida, the traveler, and Paimon that she will keep a watchful eye as we move forward. She then wonders to herself how far will the life so dear and precious to the heavenly principles will be able to go. Now, if she is referring to humans, then it's undoubtedly a reference to the primordial one, as he was known to heavily favor the humans. Alternatively, the heavenly principles could just be one of his shades, who perhaps created the gods, and thus Nahida is the one being referenced here. Either way, there is a strong case now that the heavenly principles is either the primordial one itself or one of its shades. The second interesting thing in her speech is that for some time, our only source of information on the primordial one and the events of this era was from one book, Before the Sun and the Moon. Apep's story, if it is indeed true, corroborates the story that we have in the book, at least to some degree, making the source a bit more trustworthy and not just random scribbles. The third interesting thing about this part of her speech is that the Dragon King had brought forbidden knowledge from outside this world to combat the heavenly principles. This forbidden knowledge ended up becoming the Withering and Elazar, as well as the corrupting power affecting Apep. Now the way it's described makes it kinda easy to assume what this forbidden knowledge was, at least on the surface. We might directly think about abyssal powers, considering the abyss is a realm of its own, therefore making it kinda outside of Tevat, and it's implied several times to be a powerful source of energy. I don't doubt this at all. Forbidden knowledge could very well be abyssal energy or some variation of it. However, the line about the Dragon King sourcing this power from outside of the current world also makes me kinda think it's got to do with the universe Tevat is in. Now, I'm not very familiar with Honkai Impact as I never played it and I don't know the lore in great detail. But given how forbidden knowledge seems to act more like a calamity, there is something that I kinda wonder. What if this power was actually the Hokai or Honkai energy? As far as I understand, the Honkai is a force of nature that aims to test humans or any sentient being in the many different realities that the game universe inhabits. It manifests itself not only physically in the form of heralds of destruction like the Hershers, but can also appear as intangible things like diseases and natural disasters. This seems to be a lot more consistent with how we've seen forbidden knowledge affect Tevat. Elazar is an incurable disease, while the Withering mutates and corrupts the flora and fauna around it. Elemental beings affected by forbidden knowledge are filled with anger and the urge to enact destruction, which seems to be in line with the purpose of the Honkai. Perhaps the Abyss itself is just another form of the Honkai, but seeing as how Tevat is said to be separated from that other universe, this is just a guess on my part that I find interesting. Now again, I'm not too familiar on the lore of Honkai Impact, so if anyone wants to provide a bit more context to this and clarify if this makes sense at all, feel free to do so in the comments. Finally, let's get back to the topic of the Dragon King Nibelung. This is one area which we likely won't be able to guess because this is, as far as I know, the first mention of such a character. Up till this point, the 7 sovereigns were not described to be coordinated in any way. It was implied that they had their own regions and steered clear of one another, but with the introduction of the Dragon King, those initial assumptions may have been inaccurate. We can't even really guess where the Dragon King originated from, or if they were one of the 7. It's also possible that the Dragon King is from the Abyss itself, seeing as how he was said to have brought them the forbidden knowledge. The name also doesn't really hint at anything specific, because when I search up mythologies relating to Nibelung, there are mention of dragons, but they can refer to many different mythologies at the same time. Another interesting thing is that while the Dragon King was said to have been defeated and killed during the first battle with the Primordial One, Apep goes on to say that he eventually returned. This means that in the current timeline, he might very well be alive and active. In fact, the Dragon King could be one of the potential candidates for the Sinner. In the Pale Flame artifact set, Khaenri'ah was said to have torn open the Veil of Sin, which led to Celestia attacking them. Coincidentally, the Sinner seems to have appeared right after this as well, making me believe these are related events, with the Sinner appearing right after the Veil of Sin was torn. If the Dragon King really is the Sinner, it's possible that after losing the battle, he was imprisoned in the Abyss or something, and after Khaenri'ah's prodding ended up being released. Although it's difficult to be 100% sure as there is another big baddie yet to be accounted for, the second who came. So for now, the identity and whereabouts of the Dragon King will have to remain as a mystery. Bringing this video to an end, the quest was actually quite an interesting surprise. I really did not expect to get exposition on the early days of Tevat and expanding that era of the story even more. The scale and size of Apep is just monstrous, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of the sovereigns in the future storyline. We are definitely getting closer to the endgame of the story, and from here on out, it seems things might just ramp up, which makes me excited overall. That brings the video to an end though, and I hope that some of these explanations gives you a bit more context as to what the heck Apep was talking about. If you found it informative or even just entertaining, do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one, and as usual, I hope you have a good day ahead.